her bank flag still flying, all hands busy as beavers in the glorious morning light. Disko stood by the main hatch, superintending Manuel, Penn, and Uncle Salters at the tackle. Dan was swinging the loaded baskets inboard as Long Jack and Tom Platt filled them, and Harvey, with a notebook, represented the skipper's interest before the clerk of the scales on the salt-sprinkled wharf edge. "Ready!" cried the voices below. "Haul!" cried Disko. "Hi!" said Manuel. "Here!" said Dan, swinging the basket. Then they heard Harvey's voice, clear and fresh, checking the weights. The last of the fish had been whipped out, and Harvey leaped from the string piece 6 feet to a ratline, as the shortest way to hand Disko the tally, shouting, "297 and an empty hold." "What's total, Harve?" said Disko. "865. $3,676.25. Wish I'd share as well as wage." "Well, I won't go so far as to say you haven't deserved it, Harve. Don't you want to slip up to Wouverman's office and take him our tallies?" "Who's that boy?" said Cheyne to Dan, well used to all manner of questions from those idle imbeciles called summer boarders. "Well, he's a kind of supercargo," was the answer. "We picked him up stuck adrift on the Banks. Fell overboard from a liner, he says. He was a passenger. He's by way of bein' a fisherman now." "Is he worth his keep?" "Yep. Dad, this man wants to know if Harve's worth his keep. Say, would you like to go aboard? We'll fix a ladder for her." "I should very much, indeed. 'Twon't hurt you, Mama, and you'll be able to see for yourself." The woman who could not lift her head a week ago scrambled down the ladder and stood aghast amid the mess and tangle aft. "Be you anyways interested in Harve?" said Disko. "Well, yes." "He's a good boy, and ketches right hold jest as he's bid. You've heard how we found him. He was sufferin' from nervous prostration, I guess, or else his head had hit somethin' when we hauled him aboard. He's all over that now. Yes, this is the cabin. 'Tain't anyways in order, but you're quite welcome to look around. Those are his figures on the stovepipe where we keep the reckonin' mostly." "Did he sleep here?" said Mrs. Cheyne, sitting on a yellow locker and surveying the disorderly bunks. "No. He berthed forward, madam, and only fer him and my boy hookin' fried pies and muggin' up when they ought to have been asleep. I dunno as I've had any special fault to find with him." "There warn't nothin' wrong with Harve," said Uncle Salters, descending the steps. "He hung my boots on the main truck, and he ain't over and above respectful to such as knows more'n he do, 'specially about farmin', but he were mostly misled by Dan." Dan, in the meantime, profiting by dark hints from Harvey early that morning, was executing a war dance on deck. "Tom, Tom," he whispered down the hatch. "His folks has come, and Dad hain't caught on yet, and they're powwowing in the cabin. She's a daisy, and he's all Harve claimed he was, by the looks of him." "Holy smoke!" said Long Jack, climbing out covered with salt and fish skin. "D'ye believe his tale of the kid in the little 4-horse rig was true?" "I knew it all along," said Dan. "Come and see Dad mistook in his jedgments." They came delightedly, just in time to hear Cheyne say, "I'm glad he has a good character, because he's my son." Disko's jaw fell. Long Jack always vowed that he heard the click of it, and he stared alternately at the man and the woman. "I got his telegram in San Diego 4 days ago, and we came over." "In a private car?" said Dan. "He said you might." "In a private car, of course." Dan looked at his father with a hurricane of irreverent winks. "There was a tale he told us of driving 4 little ponies in a rig of his own," said Long Jack. "Was that true, now?" "Very likely," said Cheyne. "Was it, Mama?" "He had a little drag when we were in Toledo, I think," said the mother. Long Jack whistled. "Oh, "Disko!" said he, and that was all. I am mistook in my jedgments. Worse'n the men of Marblehead," said Disko, as though the words were being windlassed out of him. "I don't mind ownin' to you, Mr. Cheyne, as I mistrusted the boy to be crazy. He talked kinder odd about money." "So he told me." "Did he tell you anything else? 'Cause I pounded him once." This with a somewhat anxious glance at Mrs. Cheyne. "Oh, yes," Cheyne replied. "I should say it probably did him more good than anything else in the world." "I jedged 'twas necessary, or I wouldn't ha' done it. I don't want you to think we abuse our boys any on this packet." "I don't think you do, Mr. Troop." Mrs. Cheyne had been looking at the faces. Disko's ivory yellow, hairless, iron countenance, Uncle Salters's, with its rim of agricultural hair, Penn's bewildered simplicity, Manuel's quiet smile, Long Jack's grin of delight, and Tom Platt's scar. Rough by her standards they certainly were, but she had a mother's wits in her eyes, and she rose with outstretched hands. "Oh, tell me, which is who?" said she, half sobbing. "I want to thank you and bless you, all of you." "Faith, that pays me 100 times," said Long Jack. Disko introduced them all in due form. The captain of an old time Chinaman could have done no better, and Mrs. Cheyne babbled incoherently. She nearly threw herself into Manuel's arms when she understood that he had first found Harvey. "But how shall I leave him drieft?" said poor Manuel. "What do you yourself if you find him so? Eh, what? We are in one good boy, and I am ever so pleased he come to be your son." "And he told me Dan was his partner," she cried. Dan was already sufficiently pink, but he turned a rich crimson when Mrs. Cheyne kissed him on both cheeks before the assembly. Then they led her forward to show her the foc'sle, at which she wept again, and must needs go down to see Harvey's identical bunk, and there she found the nigger cook cleaning up the stove, and he nodded as though she were some one he had expected to meet for years. They tried, two at a time, to explain the boat's daily life to her, and she sat by the pawl post, her gloved hands on the greasy table, laughing with trembling lips and crying with dancing eyes. "And who's ever to use the We're Here after this?" said Long Jack to Tom Platt. "I feel it as if she'd made a cathedral of it all." "Cathedral!" sneered Tom Platt. "Oh, if it had ever been the Fish Commission boat instead of this ballyhoo of blazes! If we only had some decency and order and side boys when she goes over! She'll have to climb that ladder like a hen, and we ought to be manning the yards." "Then Harvey was not mad," said Penn slowly to Cheyne. "No, indeed, thank God," the big millionaire replied, stooping down tenderly. "It must be terrible to be mad. Except to lose your child, I do not know anything more terrible. But your child has come back? Let us thank God for that." "Hello," said Harvey, looking down upon them benignly from the wharf. "I was mistook, Harve. I was mistook," said Disko swiftly, holding up a hand. "I was mistook in my jedgments. You needn't rub it in any more." "Guess I'll take care of that," said Dan under his breath. "You'll be goin' off now, won't you?" "Well, not without the balance of my wages, 'less you want to have the We're Here attached." "That's so. I'd clean forgot." And he counted out the remaining dollars. "You done all you contracted to do, Harve, and you done it 'baout as well as if you'd been brought up." Here Disko brought himself up. He did not quite see where the sentence was going to end. "Outside of a private car?" suggested Dan wickedly. "Come on, and I'll show her to you," said Harvey. Cheyne stayed to talk to Disko, but the others made a procession to the depot, with Mrs. Cheyne at the head. The French maid shrieked at the invasion,